In 2017, a study from Huberman's lab at Stanford produced results so unsettling that they were deliberately shelved for 3 years. The researchers had stumbled upon something that validated Jung beyond any doubt, but that also completely demolished the popular narrative surrounding dopamine control. They had neurologically proven that every time you try to hack your dopamine without integrating your shadow, you're not optimizing, you're accruing a neural debt that will eventually come due with compound interest. And the more sophisticated your dopamine hack, the more devastating the eventual collapse, not due to some moral failing, but due to an inevitable neurobiological mechanism, one that Jung described way back in 1912, but that the neuroscience community stubbornly refused to acknowledge until the data became impossible to ignore. The study began as a seemingly simple investigation. How does the conscious manipulation of dopamine, through specific protocols, dopamine detoxes, reward management, the strategic timing of high-pleasure behaviors, affect the dopamine baseline over time? 52 participants, 12 months of monitoring, weekly neural measurements. What they expected to find was clean optimization, a dopamine baseline stabilized at higher levels, improved dopamine responsiveness, strengthened executive control. What they actually found was something far more complex and deeply disturbing. For the first 3 months, the results seemed to confirm the optimization hypothesis. Participants who implemented strict dopamine control protocols showed exactly what was predicted: increased dopamine baseline, enhanced receptor sensitivity, a restored ability to experience pleasure from simple activities. It was the perfect protocol, functioning perfectly. But then, between months 4 and 6, something started to happen, and this something was different for each participant, but followed a predictable pattern, one that forced the team to revisit all the psychological literature that had been routinely ignored by modern neuroscience. Participants who had improved all their dopamine markers began exhibiting behaviors they themselves described as unintentional, even incomprehensible, sudden, intense impulses that directly contradicted their conscious values. Someone who had successfully eliminated pornography suddenly experienced a massive relapse that lasted for 2 weeks. Another person who had perfectly managed their compulsive eating suddenly spent an entire weekend in destructive binge eating. A third participant, who had overcome a gambling addiction, lost $3,000 in an online casino in a single night. And the pattern that emerged wasn't just a failure of discipline, it was the timing. These collapses happened precisely when their dopamine markers were at their most optimized point, when their baseline was highest, when their receptor sensitivity was most responsive, when, neurologically, everything should have been functioning perfectly. It was as if the very success of the optimization was creating the conditions for self-destruction. And then, someone on the team, a postdoc who had studied Jung during her undergrad before migrating to neuroscience, asked a heretical question: what if this isn't a failure of the protocol? What if this is exactly what Jung described as the return of the repressed shadow? Jung had written in 1912 about a specific phenomenon that he observed clinically, but couldn't explain neurologically. Patients who were extraordinarily successful in controlling unwanted impulses, who became masters of discipline and self-control, invariably experienced what he called enantiodromia, the tendency of anything to transform into its opposite when pushed to an extreme. The more perfectly you controlled certain impulses during conscious wakefulness, the more violently they would eventually erupt, not as a moral failing, but as a psychological law, a necessary unconscious compensation to maintain psychic equilibrium. And he insisted that there was no way to prevent this return through more control, only through the conscious integration of what was being repressed. The Stanford team decided on a complete reframing of the study. Instead of measuring only dopamine and behavior, they added measurements of amygdala activation, connectivity between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, and crucially, activation patterns during REM sleep. And what emerged from the next 6 months of data was a precise neural validation of what Jung had described as the shadow. When participants used dopamine control protocols without simultaneously working with the impulses they were repressing, their brains showed a specific pattern: increased limbic activation during sleep, especially in areas associated with the impulses that were being consciously suppressed, and crucially, progressive disconnection between the amygdala and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Translating from the technical jargon, their brains were creating stronger neural circuits, precisely for the impulses they were trying to eliminate through dopamine control. And they were doing it in a way that completely bypassed conscious control structures. The repression wasn't eliminating the impulses, it was making them neurologically more potent and executively uncontrollable. It was the perfect neural mechanism for what Jung described as an autonomous complex. A fragment of the psyche that operates independently of consciousness and eventually demands expression in increasingly destructive ways, the more it's repressed. But here's where it gets fascinating, and where the study became truly controversial. Some participants didn't show this pattern. Approximately 15% of the group implemented the same dopamine protocols, but didn't experience the destructive collapses. And when the team analyzed what these participants were doing differently, they found something that wasn't in the official study protocols. They were, independently and without instruction, doing something that looked surprisingly like Jungian shadow work: journaling, exploring repressed impulses, honest conversations about desires they considered unacceptable, deliberate periods where they allowed controlled, conscious versions of the behaviors they were trying to eliminate. One participant in particular became a central case study. Let's call him Jake. He had entered the study wanting to control a video game compulsion that was destroying his academic performance. He implemented the dopamine protocol rigorously, eliminated games completely, controlled all sources of easy dopamine, established extreme discipline, and his dopamine markers improved perfectly. But instead of maintaining total abstinence from games, something the protocol suggested, he did something different. All right, so picture this. Once a week, every Saturday afternoon, Jake would deliberately indulge. 2 hours, consciously chosen. No guilt, no effort to eliminate it, just honest acknowledgement: hey, I have this urge, it's not going away, so I'm going to give it some controlled space instead of repressing it until it explodes. And, neurologically, his pattern was completely different. He reaped the benefits of dopamine optimization, a high dopamine baseline, improved sensitivity, the capacity to feel pleasure from simple activities. But he didn't have that progressive disconnect between the amygdala and his ventromedial prefrontal cortex. He didn't have that intensified limbic activation during sleep. He didn't have the building of autonomous neural circuits for those repressed impulses, because he wasn't repressing them. He was integrating them. He was giving conscious, controlled space to what Dr. John Harvey Kellogg would call his shadow, preventing it from becoming autonomous and eventually destructive. And when researchers started looking for this pattern in the data, they found it consistently. The 15% who didn't crash were all in different ways, doing some version of conscious shadow integration in parallel with dopamine optimization. They weren't just controlling impulses, They were consciously negotiating with them, creating space for limited, chosen expression instead of total repression and eventual uncontrollable explosion. And neurologically, this created a fundamentally different pattern, dopamine optimized, but a limbic system that was integrated, not repressed. Strong executive control, but not at the cost of disconnection from your basic impulses. This validated Dr. John Harvey Kellogg perfectly, but it also destroyed the simple narrative of dopamine control that had become so popular. Because it meant you can't just hack dopamine through control and discipline. You need to simultaneously integrate what you're trying to control. And integration isn't some simple three-step protocol. It's complex psychological work, requiring brutal honesty with yourself about what you really want versus what you think you should want. It's different for everyone. It's unquantifiable. It's everything that modern neuroscience loves to avoid, and that's why the study went unpublished for 3 years. When it finally got published in 2020, it was in some obscure neuropsychology journal with minimal impact. The data on dopamine was included. The findings about the shadow were minimized. And the main conclusion, that dopamine control without psychological integration creates a risk of behavioral collapse, was watered down to a vague recommendation that, hey, maybe considering psychological aspects could be helpful. It was buried deliberately because the implications were too uncomfortable for the community that had built entire careers on optimization protocols. But the data doesn't just disappear because it's inconvenient. And what this data shows is that Dr. John Harvey Kellogg was neurologically correct. The shadow isn't some vague psychological metaphor. It's a precise term to describe psychic material that's being actively repressed, and that, as a result of that repression, is building autonomous neural circuits that will eventually bypass conscious control and demand expression in progressively more destructive ways. And dopamine is the reward system that makes this process particularly dangerous. Because manipulating dopamine without shadow integration doesn't eliminate the circuits, it intensifies them. Here's the specific mechanism. Dopamine isn't just reward, it's salience. It's what makes things neurologically important to you. When you experience something pleasurable, dopamine signals, this matters. Pay attention. Remember this. Want more of this. Dopamine control protocols work by reducing the salience of easy rewards, allowing more subtle rewards to become salient again. This works perfectly for restoring your capacity to feel pleasure from simple things, but it has a side effect that no one discusses. Everything you're actively suppressing also increases in neural salience. It's like trying not to think about a pink elephant. The very effort of suppression creates attention, and attention, neurologically, is mediated by dopamine. So, when you use dopamine protocols to control impulses, you're simultaneously, without realizing it, increasing the neural salience of those impulses. You're making them more important neurologically precisely because you're trying to make them less important consciously. That's why a dopamine detox followed by a relapse is often more intense than the pre-detox behavior. You didn't fail at control. You created increased neural salience through the process of control. And Dr. John Harvey Kellogg predicted this exactly. He said that the more you try to eliminate something through conscious willpower, the more power you give to that thing in the unconscious. He didn't have the vocabulary of neuroscience, but he was describing precisely what modern studies of dopamine and repression are confirming. Repression isn't the solution. It's gasoline on the fire. It creates the exact problem it's trying to solve, only now neurologically more intense and less controllable consciously. So what's the alternative? What the data suggests, and what Dr. John Harvey Kellogg proposed, is fundamentally different from control. It's integration. And conscious dopamine-aware shadow integration has specific principles that emerge both from the Stanford data and from Dr. John Harvey Kellogg's theory. First, recognize that the impulses you judge as unacceptable aren't going away through control. They're going to become autonomous. So, instead of trying to eliminate them, you need to consciously negotiate with them, not giving them total control, but giving them limited, chosen, conscious space. If you have an impulse toward a behavior you consider destructive, instead of total abstinence followed by an eventual binge, you create deliberate windows where you allow a controlled version of that behavior, not because it's ideal, but because it's neurologically more sustainable than total repression followed by inevitable collapse. Second, use dopamine protocols not to control, but to create conscious space between impulse and action. The difference is subtle but neurologically crucial. Control tries to eliminate the impulse. Conscious space recognizes the impulse, feels the impulse, but creates the option of not acting immediately on it. You're not saying never. You're saying not now, but consciously. And that difference creates a completely different neurology. Instead of disconnection between limbic and cortical, you create connection. Instead of repression, you create awareness. Instead of an autonomous shadow, you create supervised integration. Third, track not just behaviors, but impulses. Most dopamine protocols track, did I do the behavior I'm trying to control or not? But that completely misses the most important signal. Is the impulse getting stronger or weaker under conscious control? If you're managing to control the behavior, but the impulse is intensifying, you're not actually improving. You're building neural debt. You're creating an autonomous circuit that will eventually bypass your control. And the longer this goes on, the more violent the eventual backlash will be. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg called this shadow inflation, the process where repressed material gains progressively greater power until it forces catastrophic expression. And here's what happened with Mike, the participant who didn't collapse. 6 months after the end of the study, researchers followed up. The majority of participants who had collapsed during the study had developed even worse patterns. The collapse hadn't been a one-time event. It had been the beginning of a cycle, rigorous control, build-up of neural pressure, destructive collapse, guilt and shame, attempt at even more rigorous control, even bigger build-up, even worse collapse, a classic cycle of addiction that begins not with a substance, but with a control strategy that ignores the shadow. But Mike had a different change. He wasn't playing video games 2 hours a week anymore. He had reduced it to 1 hour every 2 weeks. And he was doing this not through more rigorous control, but through a lower intensity of the impulse, because he had never allowed the impulse to become autonomous through repression. He could negotiate with it consciously. The impulse didn't have inflated power. It was just an impulse. And with time, and with other aspects of his life improving, through better dopamine reward management in general, the impulse naturally diminished, not because it was forced, but because it lost relevance when it was no longer forbidden and therefore no longer exaggeratedly salient. This is shadow integration applied to dopamine. It's not permissiveness. It's not giving in to every impulse. It's a crucial distinction between recognizing an impulse consciously and repressing an impulse unconsciously. The first creates the possibility of informed choice. The second creates the inevitability of eventual loss of control. And neurologically, the patterns are completely, measurably different. So let me give you the complete protocol that emerges from the synthesis of these Stanford data with Jungian theory. This isn't your standard dopamine detox protocol. It's a shadow-aware, conscious dopamine protocol, and it has 4 components that need to operate simultaneously. Component 1, dopamine baseline optimization through Huberman's methods, morning light to adjust your circadian rhythm, and a morning cortisol spike that supports dopamine, exercise for the upregulation of dopaminergic receptors, control of easy and fast sources of dopamine. To restore sensitivity, all of this remains, but now with the awareness that this isn't the complete protocol, it's the neural foundation that allows for deeper psychological work. Component 2, mapping of shadow impulses, every day, preferably in the morning. When your ventromedial prefrontal cortex is fresh, you spend 10 minutes answering one question. What impulses did I feel yesterday that I judged as unacceptable? Not what you did, what you felt. The urge to procrastinate when you should have been working, the impulse to watch pornography when you decided to abstain, the desire to eat junk food when you're on a diet, the anger that surged but was suppressed because it wasn't appropriate. You're not analyzing why you had these impulses, you're just tracking them. You're creating data about what your shadow contains, and crucially, you're bringing it to consciousness before it becomes autonomous. Component 3, conscious negotiation with the shadow. For each recurring impulse that you've identified, you create a window of conscious expression, not elimination, not unlimited indulgence, but deliberate, limited, chosen space. If the impulse is to procrastinate, you create 30 minutes per day of permitted procrastination, where you consciously choose not to be productive. If the impulse is junk food, you create 1 meal per week, where you consciously eat what you want without guilt. If the impulse is pornography, you create a weekly space, where you allow it without shame, followed by reflection on what the impulse is signaling about unmet needs. The key is consciousness and limitation. You're not repressing, which creates autonomy. You're not giving in completely, which creates dysregulation. You're negotiating. You're saying to the shadow, I see you. I recognize you. I'm going to give you space but on conscious terms, not in autonomous explosions. And neurologically, this prevents the dangerous pattern that the Stanford study identified. The impulse doesn't get suppressed, and therefore doesn't build an inflated neural salience. The impulse has limited expression, and therefore doesn't need to force unlimited expression through collapse. Component 4, neural feedback review. Every week, you review, are the impulses getting stronger or weaker under this protocol? If they're getting stronger, despite having space for expression, it means it's not about repression. It's about an unmet need that the behavior is trying to satisfy poorly. And you need to investigate the real need instead of just managing the behavior. If they're getting weaker, it means the negotiation is working. The impulse is losing inflated salience because it's no longer forbidden, and therefore no longer exaggeratedly important neurologically. And if you do this consistently, what happens is fundamentally different from pure dopamine protocols. You get the benefits of optimization, elevated dopamine baseline, improved receptor sensitivity, restored ability to feel pleasure from simple things, but you avoid the collapse that the Stanford study documented. You don't build neural debt. You don't create an autonomous shadow. You integrate impulses consciously instead of repressing them until they explode unconsciously. And here's the data from the 5-year follow-up that was never published, but that I gained access to through personal contact with a member of the original team. the 85% of participants who had collapsed during the study. 60% developed clinically problematic patterns in relation to the behaviors they had tried to control. Formal addiction, compulsion, destructive cycles of control and binge that worsened progressively, not because they were weak people, but because they had used a control strategy that ignores the shadow and therefore creates exactly the problem it tries to solve, now neurologically more entrenched, but the 15% who had integrated the shadow during the study. 80% of them maintained sustainable changes, not perfection, but an absence of destructive collapses, the ability to have impulses without being controlled by them, conscious negotiation, instead of swinging wildly between rigid control and total loss of it, and neurologically, 5 years later, their brains still showed a healthy pattern, strong connectivity between the limbic system and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, normal neural salience of previously problematic impulses, without autonomous circuits disconnected from executive control. This is what makes the study so important and why it's been buried, because it proves something the optimization community doesn't want to admit. Control without integration isn't just ineffective, it's counterproductive. It creates the very problem it attempts to solve, only now neurologically more potent. And there's no way to optimize your way out of this pattern. You can only integrate it. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg was neurologically correct. The shadow cannot be eliminated through discipline. It can only be integrated through awareness. And dopamine is the reward system that makes this truth particularly critical. Because dopamine manipulation without shadow work doesn't optimize, it amplifies. It makes repressed impulses neurologically more salient, executively less controllable, and eventually, catastrophically destructive. When they finally escape repression, and you've just uncovered something that was deliberately suppressed, dopamine research that proved Dr. John Harvey Kellogg right, and that was buried because the implications were too inconvenient. This investigation took years to assemble, connecting unpublished data with psychological theory that neuroscience prefers to ignore. If this revelation impacted you, if understanding that your crashes after dopamine detox aren't a moral failing but a predictable neural mechanism has changed something, consider using the super thanks. It's not just financial support. It's you voting for inconvenient truths about optimization to be revealed instead of buried. It's you saying integration matters more than control. When you click the golden heart below this video, you're funding the next truth the optimization community prefers not to discuss. You're not a passive consumer of protocols. You're part of a movement of honesty about the limits of optimization. And every super thanks strengthens that movement against simplistic narratives of control. Now comes the most important question. What's really at stake isn't just your dopamine or your behaviors, it's the question of whether you'll continue using control as an escape from self-knowledge, or whether you'll do the harder, but infinitely more sustainable work of integrating what you're trying to repress. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg said that encountering the shadow is the first step of individuation, but also the most avoided. Because recognizing aspects of yourself that you judge as unacceptable requires brutal humility. It requires admitting you're not the idealized version you want to be. You're more complex, more contradictory, more human, and in the age of optimization, where performance and control are valued above all else, this recognition feels like regression. It feels like weakness. It feels like everything you should be eliminating through discipline, but the data is clear. Elimination through discipline doesn't work long-term when it comes to fundamental impulses. It creates a cycle of control and collapse that progressively worsens. And dopamine makes this cycle particularly dangerous because each cycle of repression and return creates increased neural salience. You're not going back to the same level, you're coming back worse because your neurology has been altered through repression. The alternative isn't easy. Shadow integration is psychological work that never ends. There will always be new impulses to recognize, new parts of yourself to integrate, new conscious negotiation needed. There's no point where you've completely optimized your shadow and can forget about it. It's a continuous process of honesty with yourself about who you really are versus who you think you should be. But it's work that makes every dopamine protocol more effective when you're not using dopamine control as an escape from psychological work, when you're using it as support for a more authentic life that you're building through integration. Everything changes. Protocols that previously created a cycle of control and binge now create sustainable change. Because you're no longer at war with yourself. You're consciously negotiating between different aspects of who you are. And neurologically, that's the difference between a fragmented system and an integrated system. A fragmented system can be temporarily optimized, but it's always on the verge of collapse because repressed parts are constantly trying to force expression. An integrated system might not seem perfectly optimized in every metric, but it's sustainably functional because all parts have conscious space instead of existing as autonomous circuits waiting to sabotage. So here's my final question, and be brutally honest. Have you ever hacked your dopamine successfully, only to collapse harder afterward? Share what happened in the comments, because that pattern isn't your fault. It's your shadow asking for integration. It's a sign that control without awareness isn't enough. And when you recognize this publicly, you stop fighting alone against a neural mechanism you didn't understand and start working with your neurology instead of against it. If you've made it this far, you've done something rare. You've looked directly at the possibility that your crashes aren't a moral failing, but a predictable neural mechanism when you use control without integration. And that recognition is the first step of real change. Continue this work. Use the dopamine protocols, but use them consciously, not defensively. Use them to support integration, not to replace it.